In the operating room of Mount Sinai Hospital, Dr. Marcus Williams had exactly 12 minutes to make a decision that would either save a life or end his career. Operating on Sarah Mitchell, a prominent socialite known for her racist views who had explicitly requested no colored doctors in her medical file. As his skilled hands held her failing heart, he couldn't have known that this single surgery would ignite a national controversy, threaten everything he'd worked for, and expose the deep wounds of prejudice still festering in modern medicine. But what no one expected was how this moment would transform not just Marcus's life, but also the woman who tried to destroy him, proving that sometimes the greatest healing happens not on the operating table, but in the human heart. The emergency room doors burst open at Mount Sinai Hospital, breaking the relative calm of the Tuesday morning shift. The paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney carrying a well-dressed elderly woman, whose pearl necklace contrasted sharply with the oxygen mask covering her face. Female, 60 years old, severe chest pain radiating to the back. One paramedic shouted, BP 190/100, heart rate 120, possible aortic dissection. Dr. Marcus Williams had just finished his morning rounds when the code blue alert echoed through the hospital corridors. He sprinted toward the emergency room, his white coat billowing behind him. At 35, he was one of the youngest cardiothoracic surgeons at Mount Sinai, but his reputation preceded him. His colleagues often joked that his hands were blessed by the gods of medicine. The patient, Sarah Mitchell, lay writhing in pain on the gurney. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the sheets, and her carefully styled silver hair was now a disheveled mess. Her expensive designer outfit and jewelry suggested affluence, but in that moment, she was just another patient fighting for her life. "Get me a CT scan, stat," Marcus ordered, his deep voice carrying the authority that came from years of making split-second decisions. As he examined Sarah, his mind was already racing through the possibilities. The symptoms aligned perfectly with his initial suspicion. An aortic dissection, one of the most lethal cardiovascular emergencies. While waiting for the CT results, Marcus's mind drifted briefly to a memory from his residency days. He was standing in a similar emergency room, facing a different kind of emergency, one of prejudice rather than medicine. "I don't want him touching me," the patient had said, pointing at Marcus. "Get me a real doctor." The attending physician, Dr. Richardson, had stepped forward. "Dr. Williams is one of our finest residents. Your life might depend on his skills today." That day had strengthened Marcus's resolve. Every slight, every doubtful glance, every racist comment had only pushed him to work harder, study longer, and prove himself beyond any question. He graduated top of his class at Johns Hopkins, completed his residency at Mayo Clinic, and now stood as one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in New York. The CT scan results appeared on the screen, confirming his diagnosis. Sarah Mitchell's aorta was literally tearing apart. Without immediate surgery, her chances of survival were minimal. "Or one is ready, Dr. Williams," a nurse announced. "Her pressure's dropping," another called out. Marcus turned to the team. "We don't have time for formal consent. This is life or death. Let's move." As they rushed toward the operating room, Marcus caught fragments of conversation about Sarah Mitchell. She was a prominent figure in local politics, known for her charitable work, but also for her controversial views on traditional values and maintaining community standards, often coded language for something far less charitable. In the OR, Marcus worked with the precision and focus that had become his trademark. His surgical team moved in perfect synchronization, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. The operation would be complex, a full aortic repair that would test even his considerable skills. "Scalpel," he called out, and the cold steel touched his gloved hand. As he made the initial incision, he couldn't know that this surgery would mark the beginning of a battle that would test not just his surgical skills, but his very identity as a doctor and a human being. The monitors beeped steadily as Marcus worked, his movements precise and deliberate. Hours passed like minutes as he repaired the torn vessel. Blood pressure dropped dangerously low twice, but Marcus's quick thinking and steady hands kept Sarah Mitchell alive. "Come on, Mrs. Mitchell," he muttered under his breath as he placed the final suture. "You've got more living to do, whether you like me or not." Finally, after 6 intense hours, Marcus stepped back from the operating table. "Surgery successful," he announced to the team. "Great work, everyone." As the team began post-operative procedures, Marcus took a moment to document the surgery. His hands, steady throughout the operation, now trembled slightly as he removed his surgical gloves. The adrenaline was wearing off, but satisfaction filled his chest. He had done what he was born to do, save a life, regardless of who that life belonged to. Little did he know that Sarah Mitchell's awakening would mark the beginning of a challenge that would test everything he stood for, everything he had worked for, and everything he believed about himself and his profession. As he walked out of the OR, the morning sun was streaming through the hospital windows. Another day was beginning, and with it, a story that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could have predicted. The next 48 hours were crucial for Sarah Mitchell's recovery. Dr. Marcus Williams maintained his vigilant watch, making frequent rounds to her ICU room, checking vitals, and adjusting medications with meticulous care. The surgery had been nothing short of miraculous, a fact his colleagues couldn't stop discussing in the doctor's lounge. "I watched the recording of your surgery, Dr. Jennifer Chin, the chief of cardiology, said during their brief coffee break. "That repair was textbook perfect, Marcus. I'm using it for our residents training." Marcus smiled modestly, warming his hands around his coffee cup. The team made it possible. Everyone was in sync today. "Stop being so humble," Jennifer chided, her eyes twinkling. "You know as well as I do that what you pulled off in there was exceptional. That woman should be thanking her lucky stars you were on call." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's pager. Sarah Mitchell's vital signs were showing concerning fluctuations. He rushed to her room, where nurses were already adjusting her medication. "BP's stabilizing now, Dr. Williams," Nurse Maria Rodriguez reported. "But she's showing signs of waking up." Marcus approached the bed, checking the monitors himself. Sarah Mitchell lay there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than her public persona would suggest. Her perfectly maintained appearance from admission was gone, replaced by the raw reality of post-surgical recovery. Her silver hair lay flat against the pillow, her face pale but peaceful. As he checked her surgical site, Sarah's eyelids began to flutter. Marcus positioned himself where she could see him clearly, preparing to assess her post-operative cognitive function. This was always a delicate moment with patients, ensuring they were oriented and understanding their situation. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said softly, "I'm Dr. Williams. You're in the ICU at Mount Sinai. You've just had major surgery, but you're doing well." Sarah's eyes opened fully, taking a moment to focus. When they finally settled on Marcus's face, something shifted in her expression. What started as confusion quickly morphed into something else, something Marcus had seen too many times before. Her heart rate monitor began beeping faster. Get away from me," she croaked, her voice hoarse from the intubation tube that had been removed earlier. "Where's the doctor?" Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though he felt the familiar sting. "I am your doctor, Mrs. Mitchell. I performed your emergency surgery yesterday. You had an aortic dissection." "No." Sarah tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "I want a real doctor. A proper doctor." Nurse Rodriguez stepped forward, her face flushing with anger, but Marcus raised a hand to stop her intervention. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're disoriented. You've been through a major trauma. I'm Dr. Marcus Williams, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Mount Sinai. I performed your emergency aortic repair yesterday, and I'm here to ensure your recovery goes smoothly." Sarah's face contorted with a mixture of disgust and panic. "This is unacceptable. I demand to see another doctor immediately. How dare you operate on me without my consent? I would never have agreed to this. She didn't finish her sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication hung heavy in the air. "Code of ethics, Mrs. Mitchell," Marcus replied calmly, though his heart was racing. "When a patient's life is in immediate danger, we act to save that life. You had minutes, not hours. The surgery couldn't wait for consent." "Well, I'm not consenting now," she spat. "Get out of my room. I'll be calling my lawyer first thing in the morning." Marcus felt the eyes of his team on him as he made some final notes in Sarah's chart. Years of experience had taught him to document everything meticulously, especially in situations like this. His handwriting, usually rushed, was deliberately neat and clear as he recorded Sarah's post-operative status and her explicit rejection of his care. "Nurse Rodriguez will continue monitoring your vitals," he said professionally. "Dr. Chin, our chief of cardiology, will be consulted for your ongoing care since you've refused mine. However, I should warn you that changing your care team at this critical stage of recovery could pose additional risks." As he turned to leave, Sarah's voice followed him. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers. This is completely unacceptable." In the hallway, Nurse Rodriguez caught up with him. "Dr. Williams, you shouldn't have to deal with this. Let me report her behavior to administration." Marcus shook his head, managing a small smile. "It's not the first time, Maria. It won't be the last. Just keep detailed notes of everything. Something tells me we'll need them." He walked to his office, closed the door, and finally allowed his professional mask to slip. Sinking into his chair, he looked at the diplomas hanging on his wall: Harvard undergraduate, Johns Hopkins Medical School, Mayo Clinic residency. Years of sacrifice, countless sleepless nights, mountains of debt, and unrelenting dedication to his craft. Yet to some, none of that mattered compared to the color of his skin. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife. "Sophia, dinner tonight? You've been at the hospital for 36 hours straight." Marcus smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. He typed back, "Wouldn't miss it. Need to see you and the kids. Rough day." He had no idea just how rough things were about to get. The following days at Mount Sinai became increasingly tense as Sarah Mitchell's presence turned the cardiac unit into a battlefield. Word of her behavior spread through the hospital like wildfire, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that seemed to follow Marcus wherever he went. That morning, Marcus sat in the monthly department meeting, trying to focus on Dr. Chin's presentation about new surgical protocols. His phone kept vibrating, messages from the hospital's legal department requesting an urgent meeting. He already knew why. Dr. Williams? He looked up to find the room staring at him. Dr. Chun had apparently asked him a question. "I apologize, Jennifer. Could you repeat that?" Before she could respond, the door opened and Linda Thompson, the hospital administrator, stepped in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need Dr. Williams immediately." In Linda's office, the situation became clear. Sarah Mitchell had not only filed a formal complaint, but had also contacted several local news outlets. Her wealthy connections meant the story was gaining traction. "She's claiming you deliberately operated on her without consent because of her known views on certain matters," Linda said carefully, sliding a paper across her desk. "She's painting herself as a victim of reverse discrimination." Marcus read the complaint, his jaw tightening. "We have the emergency room footage, the CT scans, everything documented. She would have died within hours without intervention." "We know that, Marcus. But she's claiming she had a right to choose her surgeon, that you violated her rights." Linda leaned forward. "She's also suggesting you were unnecessarily rough during the surgery, claiming her post-operative pain is excessive." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity. The pain is because her aorta was literally tearing apart. The surgery saved her life. "Her daughter is here," Linda added softly. "She's asking to speak with you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The daughter wants to sue me too?" "Actually, no. She seems different. She's in the conference room." Curious, Marcus made his way to the conference room. Inside, he found a young woman in her early 30s, professionally dressed, with kind eyes that reminded him nothing of Sarah Mitchell. "Dr. Williams," she stood, extending her hand. "I'm Rebecca Mitchell. I came to apologize for my mother." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. "I've been reading about you," Rebecca continued, sitting down. "Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, the research papers you've published, the lives you've saved." She paused, her voice cracking slightly. "Including my mother's." Marcus sat quietly, letting her speak. "I've spent my entire life apologizing for her views," Rebecca said, wiping a tear. "When I heard what happened, I couldn't stay silent. I want to help. I'll testify if needed. About her history, her views, everything. That could create a difficult situation with your mother, Marcus warned. Rebecca smiled sadly. Dr. Williams, I'm a civil rights attorney. My mother hasn't spoken to me in 2 years because I married a wonderful man who happens to be Mexican. The damage is already done. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Sarah Mitchell's voice carried through the door. I demand to see the hospital board. This is outrageous. That man butchered me. Marcus and Rebecca exchanged glances. Through the conference room's windows, they could see Sarah Mitchell in a wheelchair, her face red with anger, gesturing wildly at a group of nurses. Her surgical wound was clearly causing her pain, but her pride wouldn't let her acknowledge that the pain was normal, that everything had been done correctly. Mom, Rebecca called out, stepping into the hallway. What are you doing out of bed? Sarah's face turned even redder at the sight of her daughter. You're part of this conspiracy too, aren't you? Coming here to support him instead of your own mother. I'm here because you're making a terrible mistake, Rebecca replied firmly. Dr. Williams saved your life. He had no right at all. Sarah's voice was rising, drawing more attention. I would rather have died than have him touch me. The words hung in the air like poison. Hospital staff stopped in their tracks. Patients and visitors stared. And Marcus stood there, feeling the weight of every eye on him, maintaining his professional composure even as Sarah's words cut deep. Mrs. Mitchell, he said calmly, stepping forward, you're risking your recovery by being out of bed. Whatever issues you have with me, your health should come first. Don't you dare pretend to care about my health. You just wanted to make some sort of point, didn't you? To show you could operate on someone like me? Mom, stop it. Rebecca's voice cracked with emotion. You're embarrassing yourself. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't finished. She pulled herself up from the wheelchair, swaying slightly. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did. I'm going to. She never finished her sentence. The exertion and emotion had been too much for her recovering body. Her eyes rolled back, and she began to collapse. Without hesitation, Marcus rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. The same hand she had just been condemning now prevented her from suffering a potentially fatal fall. As the emergency response team rushed to help, Marcus found himself holding Sarah Mitchell's unconscious form, wondering how someone he'd saved could harbor so much hatred for him. But more importantly, he wondered how this situation would affect not just him, but every other minority healthcare worker who would come after him. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The incident in the hallway became the talk of Mount Sinai. While Sarah Mitchell recovered from her collapse in her hospital room, Marcus retreated to his office, trying to focus on his other patients. But the ripples of Sarah Mitchell's accusations spread far beyond the hospital walls. His computer screen displayed the latest local news headline: Prominent socialite claims discrimination in emergency surgery. The comment sections were already filling with heated debates, with some defending Sarah's right to choose and others calling out her blatant racism. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Dr. James Richardson, his old mentor from residency days, now the hospital's chief of surgery. You look like you could use this, James said, placing a cup of coffee on Marcus's desk. Though I'd suggest something stronger if we weren't on duty. Marcus managed a weak smile. Thanks, James. I keep telling myself I'm used to this, but it never gets easier, James finished, sitting down. I remember when you were my resident, facing that first racist patient. You handled it with the same grace you're showing now. Grace doesn't feel like enough anymore, Marcus admitted, running his hands over his face. I've got 3 surgeries scheduled for next week. All of them have requested another surgeon after seeing the news. James's face hardened. They can request all they want. You're the best we've got, and I'm not reassigning those surgeries unless you want me to. Marcus's phone buzzed again, another message from the hospital's legal team. The Mitchell case was becoming more complicated. Sarah's lawyers were now demanding access to all of Marcus's past surgical records, looking for any pattern they could use against him. They won't find anything, James said confidently, noticing Marcus's expression. Your record is impeccable. It's not just about me anymore, Marcus replied, standing to pace the office. Every time something like this happens, it affects everyone who looks like me. Young doctors, medical students, nurses. They all see these stories and wonder if this is what they're signing up for. As if on cue, there was another knock. Dr. Michael Zhang, one of their promising residents, stood at the door. "Dr. Williams? Do you have a moment?" Marcus gestured for him to enter. Michael, a Chinese-American resident in his second year, had always looked up to Marcus as a mentor. "I just finished rounds with Mrs. Mitchell," Michael said, his voice tight. She made some comments about foreign doctors and demanded to know where I was really from." He paused, struggling with his words. "I was born in Boston." Marcus exchanged glances with James. This was exactly what he'd been talking about, the ripple effects of prejudice spreading through the hospital. "Sit down, Michael," Marcus said gently. "Let me tell you something I learned early in my career." But before he could continue, his pager went off. Another emergency case was coming in, a cardiac trauma that needed immediate attention. "I have to take this," Marcus said, standing. "Michael, stay with Dr. Richardson. James, would you?" "Of course," James nodded. "Go save a life. That's what you do best." As Marcus rushed to the emergency room, he passed Sarah Mitchell's room. Through the window, he could see Rebecca sitting by her mother's bed, apparently in the middle of an intense discussion. Their eyes met briefly, and Rebecca gave him a supportive nod. In the ER, Marcus found himself facing another critical case, a young man with a knife wound to the chest. As he prepared for surgery, he couldn't help but notice how the patient's family looked at him with pure relief and gratitude when he explained the procedure. There was no hesitation, no prejudice, just trust in his abilities. Hours later, after successfully saving another life, Marcus stood washing his hands in the surgical scrub room. His reflection in the mirror showed the fatigue in his eyes, but also the determination that had gotten him this far. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Saw the news. The kids made you something to cheer you up. Come home early?" Attached was a picture of a crayon drawing by his 6-year-old daughter Maya. It showed a figure in a white coat with a cape, and the words, "My dad is a superhero," written in wobbly letters. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was why he kept going. Not just for himself, but for Maya, for Michael, for every person who faced discrimination while just trying to do their job. Back in the cardiac unit, he overheard two nurses discussing Sarah Mitchell's latest demands. She was now insisting on having her room cleaned by American staff only, whatever that meant to her. "Dr. Williams," called out Nurse Rodriguez, catching up to him. "The board wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. They're concerned about the publicity." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "Tell them I'll be there." As he walked toward his office to finish his paperwork, he passed the hospital's main entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see news vans parked outside. The story was growing, becoming something bigger than just one patient's prejudice. This wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell anymore. It wasn't even just about him. It was about every medical professional who had ever been judged not by their skills or dedication, but by their race, ethnicity, or appearance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Marcus had patients who needed him. And no amount of prejudice would stop him from doing what he was born to do, saving lives, one surgery at a time. The hospital boardroom was unusually full that morning. Marcus sat at the long mahogany table, surrounded by administrators, legal counsel, and department heads. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air, much like the tension that hung heavy in the room. Linda Thompson stood at the head of the table, addressing the group. "The Mitchell case has gone viral. Major news networks have picked it up, and social media is having a field day. We've received hundreds of calls, both supporting Dr. Williams and..." She paused, expressing other viewpoints. Marcus watched as she clicked through a PowerPoint presentation showing various news headlines. Socialite claims racial bias in emergency surgery. Doctor accused of performing unauthorized surgery. Hospital faces discrimination lawsuit. Mrs. Mitchell's lawyers have filed a formal lawsuit. The hospital's chief legal counsel, David Stern, announced. They're claiming emotional distress, medical battery, and discrimination. They're asking for $10 million in damages. A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus felt Dr. Chin's hand squeeze his shoulders supportively. "That's ridiculous," Dr. Richardson burst out. "Marcus saved her life. We have all the documentation, the emergency protocols." "We do," David interrupted. "But they're arguing that there was time to wait for another surgeon. They're claiming Dr. Williams deliberately took the case to make a point. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "There was no time. The CT scans, the vital signs, everything shows she had minutes, not hours. Any cardiac surgeon would have made the same call." "We know that," Linda assured him. "And we're standing behind you completely. The hospital is prepared to fight this with everything we have." Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Rebecca Mitchell. "Turn on Channel 7 News now." Someone quickly pulled up the news feed on the boardroom's large screen. Sarah Mitchell was giving an interview from her hospital bed, looking frail and vulnerable, a carefully crafted appearance, Marcus suspected. "I was terrified," Sarah was saying, her voice trembling. "I woke up to find out this. This doctor had operated on me without my consent. Everyone knows my views, my beliefs. He did this deliberately to humiliate me." The reporter turned to the camera. Mrs. Mitchell's lawyers claim this is a case of reverse discrimination, where her known conservative views made her a target. Marcus watched in disbelief as Sarah continued, tears now rolling down her cheeks. "I'm in constant pain. They say the surgery saved my life, but at what cost? My rights were violated. My dignity was stripped away." The boardroom erupted in angry mutters. Dr. Chen was already pulling up Sarah's post-operative charts on her tablet. "Her pain levels are completely normal for this type of surgery. Everything is textbook perfect." "We need to respond," Linda declared. "Dr. Williams, would you be willing to make a statement?" Marcus considered carefully. His whole career, he tried to stay above the fray, to let his work speak for itself. But maybe silence wasn't enough anymore. "Yes," he said finally, "but not just for me. This needs to be about something bigger." The meeting continued with strategy discussions, but Marcus's mind was already composing what he wanted to say. He thought about young Dr. Zhang, about his daughter Maya, about every medical professional who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. Later that afternoon, Marcus stood before a forest of microphones outside the hospital. Camera lights flashed as he began to speak. 20 years ago, I made a promise to save lives. Not white lives, not black lives, not conservative or liberal lives, just lives. When Mrs. Mitchell came into our emergency room, I didn't see a socialite or someone with controversial views. I saw a human being with exactly 12 minutes before her aorta would rupture completely. He paused, making eye contact with the cameras. Medicine doesn't see color, politics, or prejudice. Disease doesn't discriminate, and neither do we. Every patient who comes through these doors deserves our best care, regardless of who they are or what they believe. That's the oath we take, and that's the oath I honored with Mrs. Mitchell's surgery. The reporters erupted with questions, but Marcus raised his hand for silence. To every young person out there facing discrimination, every medical student wondering if they belong in this profession because of how they look or where they come from, you belong here. Your skills, your dedication, your humanity, that's what matters. That's what saves lives. As he stepped away from the microphones, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. "Dr. Williams, I'm a black medical student in Atlanta. Just watched your speech. Thank you for showing us it's possible to stand tall." Back in his office, Marcus found Rebecca waiting for him. Her eyes were red from crying. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Marcus stopped her. "Don't apologize for her. You're doing the right thing by standing up for what's right." "The lawsuit," Rebecca said, pulling out some papers. "I've been reviewing it. There are holes in their argument, big ones. I want to help your legal team, if you'll let me." Before Marcus could respond, his pager went off. Another emergency case. The legal storm would have to wait. Right now, someone needed his help, and that would always come first. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and protesters on both sides as Marcus climbed them 3 months later. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves skittered across the stone steps. His wife Sophia walked beside him, her hand firmly clasped in his, while their legal team surrounded them like a protective shield. Inside the courtroom, Sarah Mitchell sat with her legal team, looking appropriately fragile in a conservative suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. The transformation from angry patient to vulnerable victim was complete. Only Rebecca, sitting in the gallery behind Marcus, knew the truth behind her mother's carefully crafted appearance. Judge Eleanor Martinez called the court to order. Mitchell versus Williams in Mount Sinai Hospital, case number 2024, CV 7856. Opening statements, please. Sarah's lawyer, Richard Bennett, rose smoothly to his feet. His expensive suit and commanding presence spoke of countless courtroom victories. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, this case is about choice. About a woman's right to choose her medical care. A right that was violently stripped away by a doctor with an agenda. Marcus listened as Bennett painted a picture of a vulnerable woman subjected to unwanted surgery, suggesting that other surgeons were available but deliberately not called. The narrative was crafted to play on prejudices while appearing to defend patient rights. When the hospital's attorney, Maria Gonzalez, stood for her opening statement, her approach was different. She didn't try to match Bennett's theatrical style. Instead, she simply played the emergency room security footage. The courtroom watched in silence as the scene unfolded. Sarah being rushed in, the critical vital signs, Marcus and his team working frantically to save her life. The timestamp showed exactly how little time they had. The facts are simple, Maria stated. Dr. Williams had 12 minutes to make a decision. He chose to save a life. That's not an agenda. That's medicine. The trial proceeded with medical experts testifying about the standard of care in emergency situations. Dr. Chun presented Sarah's surgical records, demonstrating that every aspect of her care had been exemplary. But it was during Sarah's testimony that the tide began to turn. And how did you feel when you discovered Dr. Williams had operated on you? Bennett asked his client. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Violated. Frightened. I had made my views clear many times about certain people. He knew that. He took advantage of my unconscious state too. Objection. Maria stood. Speculation about Dr. Williams's motivations. Sustained, Judge Martinez ruled. During cross-examination, Maria approached Sarah with a stack of documents. Mrs. Mitchell, are you aware that Dr. Williams has performed this exact surgery 147 times in his career? I know. Are you aware that his success rate is 99.3%, the highest in the state? That's not the point. Are you aware, Maria continued, that 3 other patients were transferred to different hospitals that night because Dr. Williams was operating on you, saving your life instead of being available for them? Sarah's facade cracked slightly. I didn't ask him to. One final question, Maria said, placing a document before Sarah. This is your daughter's wedding invitation from 2 years ago. The one you returned with a note saying you wouldn't attend because you disapproved of her marrying someone of Mexican descent. Is this your handwriting? Objection. Bennett shouted. Relevance. Goes to pattern of behavior and credibility, Your Honor, Maria argued. I'll allow it, Judge Martinez ruled. The courtroom was silent as Sarah stared at the invitation, her hands trembling. The turning point came when Rebecca took the stand. Despite Bennett's attempts to paint her as an estranged daughter with a grudge, her testimony was devastating. My mother taught me that some people were better than others, Rebecca said, her voice clear and strong. She taught me to hate, but I learned differently. I learned that character isn't about color or background. It's about choices. Dr. Williams chose to save my mother's life, knowing exactly who she was and what she believed. That's not discrimination. That's grace. During his own testimony, Marcus remained professional and composed, explaining the medical necessity of his actions without emotion or defensiveness. He walked the jury through the surgery, the critical decisions, the life-saving measures. Dr. Williams, Bennett asked during cross-examination, why didn't you wait for another surgeon? Marcus looked directly at the jury. Because she would have died. In medicine, we don't have the luxury of waiting for a doctor the patient might approve of. We act to save lives. All lives. The deliberation took less than 2 hours. As the jury forewoman stood to deliver the verdict, Marcus felt Sophia's hand tighten around his. In the case of Mitchell versus Williams and Mount Sinai Hospital, we find in favor of the defendants on all counts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Sarah Mitchell sat frozen in her chair, while her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes, smiling at Marcus. But it was what happened next that no one expected. As Marcus and his team prepared to leave, Sarah Mitchell slowly approached him. The courtroom fell silent. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to say something." The courthouse hallway fell silent as Sarah Mitchell stood before Marcus, her composure cracking for the first time since the trial began. Gone was the carefully crafted victim persona, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "I almost died that night," she said, her voice trembling. "I've spent months trying to blame you, to justify my anger. But today, watching those emergency room videos, hearing the testimony," she paused, struggling with words that seemed foreign to her. "You didn't see me as Sarah Mitchell, the conservative socialite. You just saw someone who needed help." Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though his heart was racing. "That's what doctors do, Mrs. Mitchell. All doctors." "I know that now," she whispered. "My grandson. He was born last month. Rebecca's son. I haven't met him yet because of my—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Rebecca stepped forward, standing beside Marcus. "Mom?" Sarah turned to her daughter, tears now flowing freely. "I've been so wrong. About so many things. Dr. Williams, I withdraw everything. All the accusations, the complaints. I'll make a public statement." The moment was interrupted by a flurry of activity at the courthouse entrance. News crews were setting up for the post-trial interviews, eager to capture the dramatic conclusion of the case that had captivated the nation. Marcus felt a gentle touch on his arm. It was Sophia. "The kids are waiting at home," she reminded him softly. "Maya made your favorite dinner to celebrate." He nodded, then turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, healing takes time. Not just physical healing, but the other kind too. It's never too late to start." As they prepared to leave, Rebecca caught up with them. "Dr. Williams, wait. There's something else you should know. Remember those medical students who were following your case? They started something." She handed him her phone, showing him a social media movement that had sprung up during the trial. #HealingHasNoColor was trending, with thousands of healthcare workers sharing their stories of facing discrimination while saving lives. Outside, the media frenzy was in full swing. Cameras flashed as Marcus stepped up to the microphones, Sophia by his side. But before he could speak, Dr. Richardson appeared, along with Dr. Chen and a group of hospital staff. "We stand together, Dr." Richardson announced, positioning himself beside Marcus. Marcus looked at the sea of faces before him. Reporters, colleagues, supporters, and critics. He thought about all the young medical professionals watching, wondering if there was a place for them in medicine. "Today's verdict isn't just about one case," he began. "It's about recognizing that medicine is one of humanity's noblest endeavors. In the emergency room, in the operating theater, we don't see race, religion, or politics. We see human beings in need of care." He paused, making eye contact with the cameras. "To every healthcare worker who has faced discrimination, who has been judged not by their skills but by their appearance, you belong here. Your dedication, your expertise, your humanity. These are the things that matter. And to every patient," he continued, "know that when you come through our hospital doors, you will receive the best care possible, regardless of who you are or what you believe. That's not just a legal obligation, it's a moral one." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his favorite chair at home, watching Maya and her younger brother Daniel play with their toys. Maya had drawn another picture, this time of a diverse group of doctors, all wearing superhero capes. "Daddy," she asked, climbing onto his lap, "did you win today?" Marcus hugged her close, thinking about everything that had happened. "Yes, sweetheart. But more importantly, I think everyone learned something today." His phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. Mom just called. She wants to meet her grandson. Thank you for showing her another way. Another notification popped up, an email from the hospital board. They wanted to establish a new diversity and inclusion program in healthcare, and they wanted Marcus to lead it. The scars from this experience would remain, but like all scars, they told a story of healing, of survival, and of growth. Marcus thought about Sarah Mitchell, about Rebecca, about all the lives that had been touched and changed by this case. Tomorrow, he would return to the hospital, put on his white coat, and continue doing what he was born to do, saving lives, one patient at a time, proving that healing truly has no color. 6 months after the trial, Mount Sinai Hospital's auditorium was packed to capacity. The occasion was the launch of the hospital's new initiative for inclusive healthcare, with Marcus as its founding director. The social media movement #HealingHasNoColor had evolved into a national conversation about discrimination in healthcare, and hospitals across the country were implementing similar programs. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse faces before him. In the front row sat his family, Sophia beaming with pride, Maya wearing her toy stethoscope, and Daniel clutching his favorite stuffed bear. Behind them sat Rebecca Mitchell, and to everyone's surprise, Sarah Mitchell herself. When I started my medical career, Marcus began, I thought excellence would be enough. If I worked harder, studied longer, performed better than anyone else, prejudice wouldn't matter. But I've learned that it's not enough to be excellent. We must also be advocates for change. He gestured to the screen behind him, where the #HealingHasNoColor social media feed scrolled continuously, showing thousands of healthcare workers sharing their stories and support. This initiative isn't just about diversity training or recruitment policies, he continued. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about ensuring that every healthcare worker can focus on what matters most, saving lives, without the burden of prejudice. In the months since the trial, things had changed in unexpected ways. Sarah Mitchell had become an unlikely ally, speaking out against healthcare discrimination and working to change attitudes within her social circle. She was now a regular volunteer in the hospital's community outreach program, though she still sometimes struggled with her ingrained biases. Rebecca had given birth to her second child, and this time, Sarah was there in the delivery room, holding her daughter's hand. The attending physician was Dr. Zhang, the same resident who had faced Sarah's prejudice during her hospital stay. Now, she treated him with respect and gratitude. Today, we're announcing a scholarship program, Marcus revealed, for minority students pursuing careers in healthcare. But more than that, we're creating a support network, a community that says you belong here, your dreams matter, your service matters. He paused, looking at Maya, who was drawing another picture of doctors in superhero capes. My daughter once asked me if I was a superhero. The truth is, every healthcare worker is a hero. Every person who chooses to serve others, to heal others, regardless of the prejudice they might face, they're all heroes. The audience erupted in applause as Marcus introduced the first scholarship recipients, 20 diverse faces representing the future of medicine. Among them was Michael Zhang's younger sister, inspired by her brother's resilience to pursue her own medical dreams. After the ceremony, Sarah Mitchell approached Marcus, walking with the aid of a cane, a reminder of her surgery and recovery. Dr. Williams, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in the courthouse. I've been thinking about what you said about healing taking time. You were right. Some wounds are deeper than others, but they can heal if we let them. Marcus nodded, understanding the layers of meaning in her words. How's the grandson? Sarah's face lit up. Antonio, I was so foolish. He's perfect. They all are. Would you and your family join us for dinner next week? Rebecca's cooking. Before Marcus could respond, his pager went off, another emergency. Some things never changed. Go, Sarah said, smiling. Go save another life. As Marcus rushed to the emergency room, he passed the wall where Maya's superhero doctor drawing now hung framed. A rainbow of faces in white coats, all wearing capes. Below it, a new plaque read, Healing has no color in memory of all who face discrimination while saving lives, and in hope for a future where such memories are just lessons from the past. The emergency doors opened, and Marcus stepped through them, ready for whatever came next. The scars of the past 6 months had indeed made him stronger, not just as a doctor, but as a human being. And somewhere in the hospital, another young medical student was watching, learning, and finding the courage to pursue their dreams. Because in the end, healing truly has no color. It only has heart.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.